Hello, you're all very welcome to this session of the Teagasc National Beef Conference, which took place on November 21st, 2023. In this presentation that was given by Dr. Ellen Fitzpatrick from Teagasc Johnstown Castle Research Centre, Ellen's title presentation is Low Input, High Output Dairy Beef Heifer Systems. So this is really interesting presentation because it's one of the key things that when we look at the most recently published Teagasc MAC curve, earlier slaughter age is going to be one of the key measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the coming years between now and 2030 and beyond. And there's also a lot more heifers, beef heifers, especially coming from the dairy herd now than there was in the past. And we're likely to see an increase in number over the coming years because of technologies such as sex semen and that allowing for that. So, Ellen, you're very welcome to this session.
Hello. Yeah. So
Hello, Ellen. Yeah. And so you should be able to share your presentation.
perfect. Yep.
Perfect.
Can you see that there, everyone? Yeah.
Can do. Perfect.
Okay,
Thanks, Ellen.
perfect. Okay, sure, I'll get going here now then. So good morning then, everyone, and thank you for having me. So my name is Ellen Fitzpatrick, and I'm a research technologist working on the dairy calf to beef study at Teagasc and Johnstown Castle. And I suppose I'm here today to present the piece of research which we've been carrying out over the last couple of years, which is entitled Low Input, High Output Grass-Based Dairy Beef Heifer Systems. And I suppose before I get into the presentation, I'd firstly like to thank everyone that who's contributed on this over the last number of years. So especially Nikki Byrne, Paul Crossan, John Cardiff, and Riach Fox. So we have our introduction slide here. So I suppose just to give a little bit of a background as to why we've carried out this piece of research. So I suppose as a sector, we have a policy ambition to reduce our age of slaughter by up to 3 months on the beef herd, and to reduce our chemical nitrogen use by 20% on Irish farms. And this, I suppose, combined has led to can slaughter age be reduced from a predominantly grass-based diet, and can low nitrogen systems support high levels of carcass output per hectare? So these are the questions that have been posed from, I suppose, our strive to kind of achieve these targets. So I suppose nationally, our dairy beef heifers have the highest probability of failing to meet carcass specification in terms of carcass weight, conformation, age of slaughter, and carcass weight. And this has led to nationally an average age of slaughter of between 24 and 27 months for these dairy bred beef heifers from the Irish dairy herd. So we're kind of trying to see can we pull back this age of slaughter. We're also looking at kind of how nitrogen, the interaction between nitrogen and this kind of a system, how they play together. So I suppose at the minute our swards are predominantly perennial ryegrass, but in order to achieve a high level of kind of carcass performance off our swards, we need really productive and really high quality swards. And that kind of a system is very much so underpinned by high levels of chemical nitrogen input. But in order to achieve these policy targets, we're going to have to pull back on our chemical nitrogen input. So we're very much so looking towards a renewed interest in the incorporation of legumes on our farms in a bid to replace this chemical nitrogen input. And the other reason I suppose we're looking at this study is there's a very high attrition rate of farmers engaged in dairy beef production, and that kind of mostly goes down to a variable levels of animal and financial performance. And what we're very much so trying to look at is if we pull back the age of slaughter, albeit we're going to have lower carcass weights, but if we can slaughter these animals and get them relatively, in spec off pasture, we will completely eliminate the need for a housing period and concentrate supplementation on these animals. So that's kind of what we're trying to look at. And all these elements combined, that will they provide kind of a more viable option for dairy beef farmers? So I suppose the next thing I'm just going to talk about is why do we need to reduce the age of slaughter, and why are we trying to reduce our nitrogen use? So in 2022, the agricultural sector in Ireland was responsible for 38.4% of greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have a sectorial target in which we're aiming to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 25%. So we're kind of very much so aiming to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions and nitrate leaching from our agricultural practices. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to improve groundwater quality, and we want to improve our air quality. So in pulling back, I suppose, our nitrogen application, we're going to reduce the level of nitrous oxide emissions. And on average, a beef animal is going to produce between 200 and 220 grams of methane per day. And if we can pull back that age of slaughter, and we've seen from our study that we can get, some heifer slaughtered from ages as low as 16 months, that if we can pull back that age of slaughter, we're going to have a big impact on reducing the total methane emissions from the beef herd. We're also trying to very much so reduce the imports of fertilizer or feed on our farms. So if we are able to fix our own nitrogen and grow our own protein sources, as farmers, we're not as vulnerable to kind of volatile prices in terms of feed and fertilizer inputs onto our farm. We're also going to improve our nitrogen use efficiency, and there's going to be a lower fossil fuel kind of requirement associated with manufacturing and transporting of fertilizer and feed. And finally, just cost. Like, we're all trying to reduce our costs and improve the viability of these farming systems. So, with keeping our animals for longer and also, spreading additional nitrogen, it comes at a big cost to our farms. The last couple of years has seen unprecedented increases in the price of fertilizer, feed, and fuel. So, if we can, like we've seen the cost of a ton of grass go up by 29% between 21 and 22. So if we can kind of keep our animals for less time, and if we can kind of improve efficiency in terms of incorporating legumes and possibly herbs into our system, can we cut back on the level of nitrogen going out on our farms? So I suppose then, if we're going to go down the route of looking at increasing our sward diversity, we very much so have to start at the point that, the Irish beef system is very much so underpinned by efficient conversion of grazed grass into beef. And if we're going to kind of be under a system of enforced cutting of kind of levels of chemical nitrogen fertilizer, we have to look towards possibly the incorporation of clover to replace that chemical nitrogen. So what exactly are, I suppose, the benefits of improving our sward diversity? So the first thing that I'll talk about is animal performance. So, it's well reported in scientific literature that there is, an increase in animal performance with the incorporation of clover into our swards. And that's generally derived from superior sward quality, which is a reduction, which kind of manifests as a reduction of NDF content in the grass, which is able to encourage greater levels of dry matter intake. There's also a biological nitrogen fixation benefit. So the incorporation of clover into swards of perennial ryegrass has the potential to biologically fix up to 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And this occurs through the process of biological nitrogen fixation, in which there is a bacteria on the root of the clover plant that has the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen and make it plant available. And finally, there's a herbage production benefit. So I suppose there's been many studies conducted across Teagasc that have proven that, at lower nitrogen application rates, that we can grow a similar amount of grass, or an increased amount of grass, up to even 1.5 tons additional herbage grown off swards that have reduced fertilizer applications with the incorporation of legumes and herbs. And I know all this sounds very good, and I do completely appreciate that there is a downside to kind of increasing your sward diversity. So I suppose the first thing is that in intensive dairy beef regimes, it's not very well reported how multi-species and clover swards withstand kind of the intensive grazing. And there's also concerns among farmers around the kind of persistency of legumes and herbs within their swards, and the lack of availability of a post-emergent spray for our multi-species swards. So all of that information that I've just presented combined, I suppose, led us to, realizing that we very much so needed to examine the relationship between pasture type and animal, the interaction between them both. So as a result, a farm systems experiment was set up at the Teagasc Johnstown Castle Research Farm in 2021 and ran until 2023. With the primary objective of being to determine the financial and physical performance of early maturing breed dairy beef heifers consuming contrasting pasture types. So the 3 pasture types that we had on our farm was a perennial ryegrass only pasture type, and that was receiving 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. A clover pasture type, which was consisted of perennial ryegrass and a 50-50 mix of red and white clover, and that was receiving 75 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And the final pasture type was a multi-species type, and that was composed of red clover, white clover, perennial ryegrass, plantain, and chicory. And that also received 75 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. So each pasture type had its own individual farmlet, and it was 10 hectares in total, and that was stocked at 2.5 live units per hectare, which equated to 182 kilograms of organic nitrogen per hectare. So then just a little bit of a note on the management of these pasture treatments. So they were all managed completely identically. We would have used Pasture Base Ireland as kind of a management tool. We would have maintained a similar rotation length. Our spring and autumn targets would have been the exact same across the three sward types. And the only thing that differed was our fertilizer application. So that leads me on nicely to the next slide, where I'll just discuss a couple of notes on the nitrogen fertilizer application strategy that we maintained. So the first thing that I'll say is that all nitrogen that went out was in the form of protected urea. And then you'll see there that our first application that went out, which was kind of early in the springtime period, would have had the exact same amount of chemical nitrogen applied. And that's because at that time of the year, it kind of would be foreseen that there's not a high enough clover content in the sward to support kind of the level of spring grass growth that we needed. But you'll see from April onwards, we were able to cut back on the level of nitrogen applied on the clover and multi-species treatment. And that's because from April onwards, we're starting to see an increase in soil temperature. We're starting to see longer daylight hours and more sunshine. So it's kind of from that point of the year onwards that we're starting to see a kickstart in our clover content. And from July, for the July and August fertilizer applications, we foresaw that our clover content was very much so sufficient to support grass growth during those periods. So we put out absolutely no chemical nitrogen during both of those months. And then we went out with 15 kilograms across the three pasture treatments in September to build our autumn grazing covers. So this overall represented a reduction of 75 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and that very much so represents a very significant saving in fertilizer for farmers. So then just moving on to just a little bit about the management of the animals that we would have bought in for the study. So calves were bought in at on average of 20 weeks of age over the 2 years. They were on average 159 kilograms in weight on arrival, and their average date of birth was the 16th of February. And all of the calves that were bought in were sired by either Hereford or Angus bulls, and they were the progeny of Holstein Friesian dams. So upon arrival then they were assigned to one of the three pasture treatments, so grass only, grass clover or multi-species, and there would have been kind of a number of grazing management rules that we would have implemented. So we targeted a pre-grazing herbage mass of between 1300 and 1600, and we aimed for a post-grazing sward height of 5 centimetres, and that was to strive to encourage quite good quality regrowth in the subsequent rotations, but also not to have an effect on animal performance. And then all treatment groups were offered fresh herbage every 48 hours or when the target post-grazing sward height was achieved, and that was to encourage high levels of dry matter intake. Then as the grazing season progressed, we would have housed the animals in November, and that's generally when grazing conditions deteriorated and when we had reached our target closing cover of 450 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Then during the winter months, then the animals, they maintained their pasture treatment. So they were fed silages that were made off their pastures during the summer months, and that was fed to them ad lib. And then on average over the 2 winter periods, we would have fed 1.25 kilograms of concentrate. So then moving on from that, then animals would have gone out to pasture in early March, and from then on the yearlings would have been weighed every 2 weeks. And from those weighings we would have identified any animals that had a body condition score of greater than 3.75 units, and they would have been drafted for slaughter as a representation of a fat score in the factory between 3- and 3+. And then just a note on that any animals that were not slaughtered from pasture, they would have gone into the house in early October and would have been fed again all their pasture treatment silage and a finishing diet of 4 kilograms of concentrate. So then I suppose just to talk a little bit then, I've kind of told you all about what we did and why we did it, and kind of this is now moving on to like what kind of results did we get from this. So the first thing I want to say from this is that all 3 pasture treatments were treated the exact same. And I know I've said it already, but I just want to, really drive home that, we weren't given any pasture type an advantage over one over the other, and that any benefits that we're seeing in terms of herbage production or animal performance were because of superior sward quality, not because we were given one pasture type an advantage over another one. And then just another note to add would be that we would have, before every paddock was grazed, we measured pre-grazing herbage mass. When the animals came out of their allocations, we measured post-grazing sward height, and then prior to grazing for the multi-species and the clover paddocks, we would have measured by botanical composition. So just in terms of some of the herbage production results that we saw, so the herbage production from the three different treatments are presented on the graph here. So the perennial ryegrass treatment produced 11.9 tons of dry matter over the years. The clover treatment produced 11.5, and the multi-species produced 11.4. So you can see from here that there's a very similar, level of herbage production, but a big and a significant finding of this study is that we grew a similar amount of herbage with 50% less chemical fertilizer, which represents a big saving on our farms. So that's 150 kilograms versus 75. In terms of the pre-grazing herbage mass that we achieved a 1,557 kilogram dry matter pre-grazing herbage mass, and all of the three treatments grazed to 4.9 centimeters post-grazing sward height. And then just the final comment I have on this slide is that you can see here that there's a significantly lower dry matter content on the multi-species treatment compared to that on the clover and perennial ryegrass. So this trend was very much so observed throughout the entire grazing season, and it's a parameter we very much so would have taken into consideration when allocating these animals grass, that there is a significantly lower dry matter on that treatment. So next up then just is a little bit on the sward composition that we would have seen throughout the year. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see the sward composition for the clover treatment, and then on the right-hand side, it's the multi-species treatment. So I suppose to start with here, it's very well reported that we need at least a 20% average clover content in our swards to see an animal production performance benefit and to see our biological nitrogen fixation performance benefit. So we need that minimum 20% here. So for the clover treatment, the average sward composition was 20% white clover total clover throughout the entire grazing season. So it was 22% for the clover. And then the composition of the multi-species treatment was 21% clover, 46% perennial ryegrass, 25% plantain, 6% chicory, and 2% weeds. So that was kind of the average composition of the swards throughout the year. So we were well over, we were over our 20% that we were, the literature would say that we require. And those average sward compositions would take into account that clover, for example, starts at quite low levels early in the year and tends to peak in the months between kind of July and September. So that kind of takes all of that into account. For this study, peak clover content was observed in September for the clover only treatment at 32%, and it was observed in July for the multi-species treatment at 37%. Plantain peaked in March for the multi-species treatment, and chicory peaked in October for the multi-species treatment also. Then just a couple of more comments on the sward composition. So I think, as we all know that perennial ryegrass, it heads out kind of in the period of late May and early June, and that's when it goes through the reproductive growth stage, and the quality of the sward generally tends to really be quite poor at that stage. But it's from here on that you can see that that's when we're starting to see significant increases in our clover contents in both pasture types. And you can very much so see that these two species can be very much so complementary to each other, so that as perennial ryegrass quality is declining, our sward clover content is increasing, so it can provide highly nutritive pastures throughout the entire grazing season. And then the final comment I'll just make on this slide is that the growth pattern of our clover that you can see on both graphs very much so corresponds that we have sufficient levels of clover in our sward in our July and August, in the months of July and August, when we're putting out no chemical nitrogen. So we're confident that we're able to support herbage production at those time points through the year with sufficient clover content. So up to now, I suppose I've discussed the agronomic benefits of our differing pasture types, but now we want to see the effects that these, the interaction that these pasture types have with our dairy beef heifer. So, is there a performance benefit by improving your sward diversity? So the first slide that I'll talk about would be the live weight performance. And I suppose the first thing I'll bring your attention to is the first grazing season. So here we can see that there was a 27% increase in average daily gain on the multi-species treatment over that of the clover and perennial ryegrass. And then as we move then down into the first winter, we're going to see that all calves put on a similar amount of weight throughout the first winter period, irrespective of pasture type. But then it's when we move on to our second grazing season that we're really starting to see the benefit of, incorporating either clover or multi-species into our swards. So the greater, I suppose, performance in our second grazing season has led to greater lifetime performance of our multi-species and our clover animals compared to that of our perennial ryegrass. So this is very much so an indication that the pasture performance of the perennial ryegrass was lower than that of the clover and multi-species, at all time points through while grazing pasture. So it very much so shows that increasing sward diversity does have an impact on sward quality, which is translated into animal performance. And I think just in conclusion for this slide, I think a very much so a blueprint that could be adapted by any beef farmer is that, the superior performance of our calves on the multi-species would mean that putting a proportion of our grazing area under multi-species for calves, and then putting the remainder of our grazing area into clover for our yearlings would be kind of a good system to kind of optimize performance, and also you're cutting back on your nitrogen. So then just on to the slaughter performance. So while we've seen, better performance in terms of live weight gains for our clover and multi-species, I'm just going to talk now about how that translated into slaughter performance. So the first thing that I'll just bring your attention to is that the perennial ryegrass had 68% of the heifers were slaughtered off pasture. The clover treatment had 86% of the animals slaughtered off pasture, and the multi-species had 75% of animals slaughtered off pasture. So this, I suppose, the greater number of animals slaughtered off the multi-species in the clover pasture very much so translated into a lower level of concentrate, finishing concentrate requirement. So the on average, the finishing concentrate requirement for the clover group was 25 kilograms of concentrate. It was 34 kilograms of concentrate for the multi-species, and it was 62 kilograms of concentrate for the perennial ryegrass. So this very much so shows that, grazing either clover or multi-species swards, that you are very much so going to reduce your housing and concentrate requirement compared to that with your perennial ryegrass. In terms of slaughter age, the perennial ryegrass were slaughtered at 19.6 months versus 19.2 months for your multi-species and your clover. And although it took a longer time to get to slaughter for the perennial ryegrass and a greater concentrate supplementation was required, they still had a significantly lower carcass weight compared to that of the clover and multi-species. And they were also leaner, and that's represented by a half a fat score lower than that of the clover and multi-species. So, despite taking longer to get to the factory, they still weren't, good in terms of specifications as that of the clover and multi-species. So in terms of slaughter weight, the clover and multi-species had higher slaughter weights, and that was very much so translated into their higher carcass weights. So I think that this kind of very much so does prove that, if you're going to graze more diverse swards, that, you know, there's superior herbage quality, and that can lead to, you know, animals, you know, greater levels of kind of animal performance, which is translated into greater carcass gain and an ability for these animals to lay down fat slightly earlier in life. So overall, we can say that the perennial ryegrass group did not really perform as well as the other two treatment groups. And I think kind of a conclusion from this is very much so that, you know, incorporating, you know, clovers and multi-species and overall improving your sward diversity can very much so be used as a technology to kind of reach our climate action targets. And this is very much so, you know, a trend that can be applied to any sort of a beef system, albeit, you know, sucklers or you know, animals bred from the suckler herd, I mean, sorry, or, you know, steers from the dairy herd, that like these gains in performance can be applied to any of the different production systems, which I think, you know, is a really good, you know, bit of kind of research to be coming from this study. So then I suppose I've presented a lot of results there. So just to summarize them, though, you know, summarize what we've kind of concluded throughout this study, and that seems to be that incorporating clover and herbs into your system can improve your overall animal performance. So we saw, you know, 250 kilogram carcass weight versus 243 kilogram carcass weight. It can reduce your age of slaughter, so we can go from 19.6 months to 19.2 months. We were able to grow a similar amount of herbage from a reduced, you know, from 50% less chemical nitrogen fertilizer application. And then this can, because we have a lower housing requirement, we have lower concentrate requirement, and we have a lower fertilizer requirement, we can increase the profit of these systems compared to, you know, just being a ryegrass only system. So I think overall, this is very much so proven that we're doing less with more, and we've got overall improved sustainability, and it puts us one step closer towards, you know, hitting these climate action targets that have been faced with us. And then I'll just finish here with just a little bit of a talk on the new study that we've set up, and it started here in the spring in 2023. So I suppose, you know, I totally appreciate that the carcass weights that we would have achieved in this study, you know, were relatively small compared to animals that might be born from the suckler herd. So what we're kind of trying to look towards now is how can, you know, we've kind of realized that really good grassland management and really good pasture performance, and that improving or increasing our sward diversity, that we can improve performance. But now we're kind of going chasing, you know, maybe a 15 to 20 kilogram additional carcass weight. So this is kind of all being combined into the reason why we're doing this new study. So as I was saying, it started in the spring of this year, and there's a PhD student, Pádraig Coleman, working on it, along with Nikki Byrne and I from Teagasc and Alan Kelly from UCD. So what we're basically looking at is we're using the three established pasture treatments. So we have our grass only, our grass clover, and our multi-species. We have so it's basically a 3 pasture type, 2 animal maturity, and 3 slaughter age factorial design study. The 2 animal maturity levels that we are using, or the 2 animal maturity levels, are early maturing, which are represented by our Angus and Hereford animals, and late maturing, which are represented by Limousin and Belgian Blues. So all of these these animals all represent the 4 most commonly used breeds on the Irish dairy herd. And these animals would have been bought in with, you know, very much so genetic potential in mind. So they would have been bought in with a real emphasis on their carcass weight and conformation of the DBI indexes. So following on from the animal breed, then we're going to be slaughtering. So all these animals have been have been assigned to a predetermined slaughter date. So they're either going to be slaughtered at 16, 19, or 22 months of age. And that's basically to see the level of carcass gain between pasture types the carcass gain between slaughter dates at pasture is what we're kind of looking at. So this study will run for a number of years, and we hope at the end of it to be able to identify the best performing maturity on the best performing pasture type. So we really are chasing that, you know, additional carcass weight to kind of, I suppose, improve the viability of this. So just to finish up there, I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I'll welcome any questions.
That's great. Thanks, Ellen. We'll just ask you to stop sharing there at the end. We'll just get you back to full screen. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. That's really interesting work, Ellen. And especially interesting, I suppose, the fact that, you know, we've seen a lot of work coming out of Grange and Nikki Byrne and that on steers over the last number of years. So
Yep.
it's good to see heifer information starting to come through. Okay, just a couple of questions. Just to, I suppose, bring it back to maybe a bit of practical in terms of, you were saying your farms are based on a 10-hectare farmlet. How
Yep.
many Angus and Hereford calves will be bought in, say, for each 10 hectares?
So there's 30, so the first year there was 36 animals and the second year there was 35 animals bought in. So I suppose it is relatively small in terms of our numbers, but it can be scaled up like,
I know,
and
just to give
yeah,
people an idea, though, that if
yeah,
someone
yeah.
had 20, 30, 40 hectares, they can multiply that up to give them an idea in
Absolutely,
terms
yeah.
of,
So
yeah.
it's 35 or 36 is the
Okay, so in
answer.
around
Yeah,
35 animals. Yeah,
yeah,
brilliant.
yeah.
And this was 2 years data, 2 years slaughter data, was it, Ellen? Yeah,
Yeah, so it's 2 years. So animals were bought in from kind of June onwards in 21, and then we bought in a new crop of calves in 22, and we saw them through then from, I suppose, arrival the whole way through to slaughter.
great. Okay, just to clarify, I suppose, because I think it's really important that we clarify this. You were saying there at the end that these animals are slaughtered off grass. For a lot of, you gave the percentages that were slaughtered off grass: 68% off perennial ryegrass, 86% clover, and 75. I'm just to clarify the amounts of meal that were fed again. Are you saying the perennial ryegrass, they were only fed 62 kilos of
So
meal at grass?
that's kind of a representation of how it's kind of a mechanism of representation for the kind of meal fed. So what that is, it's the total number of meal fed to the cohort of animals that went into the shed divided by the total number of animals in the treatment group. So
Okay,
let's
and
say,
how much meal did they get at grass?
so they were supplemented throughout the entire grazing season with 1 kilo per day.
Okay,
And then for the first grazing season, then they were
yes,
fed on average 1.25 kilos during the winter period.
yes.
Then for the entire second grazing season, they were on no meal whatsoever. And then the animals then that weren't slaughtered off pasture in early October were
Okay,
put
yeah,
into
no,
the shed. Yeah,
that's even more impressive then, because so what we're saying is that, take the clover sward, you're saying that 86% of the heifers were slaughtered off grass
yeah,
with no meal.
yeah, essentially.
Oh,
And then that
then the other 14% went into the shed and got
they
a
went
certain
into
amount
the
of meal,
shed.
and
So
you
they
divided that.
got, yeah, so that 14% that went into the shed, they got X amount of meal, and then that was divided by
Yeah, no, no,
the
no, that's fine.
30, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. And just then a couple of other questions then, Ellen, in terms of, say, the carcass weight, your 240 to 250 was kind of across the different treatments. Um, was there any percentage of heifers that were very low carcass weights in any of the treatments?
So there is a cohort, I suppose, across the three pasture treatments, and we've kind of, I suppose that is might be representation of like that they were small calves coming in, but the
Hmm.
way we kind of try to get around that is that when the animals arrive to Johnstown, we balance them. So we balance them based on, genotype, uh, age
Oh,
at
yeah, I
arrival.
understand that. Yeah,
So
yeah.
there is a certain cohort in each treatment group
Yeah,
that,
but I suppose what I'm getting at is, what kind of carcass weights are you talking about the lowest being?
we're down to like 220.
Okay,
they are
okay.
small. They are,
Yeah,
but they were kind of animal. Like we nearly found, especially this year, that the ones that had really small carcass weights tend to be the really fat ones. That we were kind of caught both sides with them, like that
they finished earlier.
they were after laying down their fat cover. So we were kind of caught with them, but we're really hoping to counteract that in this new study. So like let's say we, in terms of just like going back to the meal fed, like we fed no meal throughout the entire grazing season for the first grazing season with these new calves. So they would have been weaned off meal in, like we've done the calf rearing ourselves. They were weaned off meal in June, and then they would have been on just pasture only until they get to the 15th September, where we go in with a kilo, just as grass quality is starting
Yeah.
to deteriorate. So, we really are trying to, we're trying to improve efficiency, cut the meal we're fed, but we're also trying to chase carcass. So we feel that like with what the results we achieved from this study, that we really showed that like really good grassland management, highly nutritious swards, and really good animal health, that we can, optimize that performance. And now we're kind of looking a step behind, I suppose, and we're looking to genetics to see can we get
Improve
that
that.
extra, we're chasing that extra carcass.
Yeah. And just finally, then, I suppose, on the grass composition and the sward composition, Ellen, is it going to be hard to keep the likes of chicory and plantain in these swards, in your opinion, going forward?
I think there is challenges with that, Pierce. Like I suppose, and I do think it's actually an opportunity of the study that we have at the minute is that, the swards are mostly sown in kind of 2019, 2020, and even going into the new study like that, we have very realistic multi-species swards on our farm. But I think the really good performance of the animals as calves on the multi-species and the really good performance of them as yearlings on the clover could mean that you could kind of combine it, that you could, sow a paddock as multi-species and let your calves graze that area. And as your herb quality or your herb quantity begins to decline, you should be left with a really good quality grass clover sward that could, work for your yearlings,
Interest.
yeah. And
Perfect.
like, I
Yep.
suppose going forward, we're also going to look into, a little bit of kind of, can we incorporate these or legumes and herbs like oversowing and different methods, but it is a
Great.
challenge with them.
Brilliant. Listen, thanks for that, Ellen, and thanks for giving this presentation at our beef
Okay.
conference on the 21st of November. We're going to leave it there. If people want to watch any of the other presentations that were given at the beef conference, they'll also be available on the Teagasc website in the same place where this recording was. Thank you. We'll leave it there.